Somewhere in the archives of the United States intelligence community is a drawing of a place the artist had never visited. Not a fantasy landscape, not an abstract sketch. A real location. Buildings, roads, structures. Details that could later be compared against reality. The drawing itself proves nothing. Anyone can put lines on paper. The problem begins when some of those lines seem to belong somewhere. For more than 20 years, intelligence agencies, military officers, scientists, and analysts wrestled with a question that sounds almost impossible to take seriously. What happens when information appears before anyone can explain where it came from? Before the story settles in, just a brief note. This video is designed for low light, slow pacing, and quiet listening. The narration stays gentle, the atmosphere stays calm, and nothing here requires your full attention if you'd rather simply drift alongside the story. If you feel like leaving a comment, tell me the time where you are, or just the corner of the world this is reaching tonight. And if these calm little documentaries have become part of your evenings, subscribing is a simple way to let me know you'd like more of them. Now, let's begin. The story that follows is not really about psychic powers. It is not a story about magic, hidden superweapons, or secret government revelations. It is a story about uncertainty, about what happens when intelligent institutions encounter something they cannot comfortably dismiss, yet cannot confidently accept. Most Cold War projects were built around machines. This one was different. Its primary instrument was the human mind. Chapter 1. A map in the dark. The pencil hesitates. For a moment, nothing happens. The room is quiet, except for the soft electrical hum of fluorescent lights that have been burning since long before sunset. Somewhere down the hall, a door closes. Papers shift. A ventilation system exhales into the silence. On the desk sits a blank sheet of paper. No photograph. No briefing folder. No map. Nothing that should help identify a distant location hidden hundreds or thousands of miles away. Only a string of numbers written at the top of the page. The numbers look important. They are not. At least not in the way most people assume. They reveal no coordinates, no country, no military installation, no clue about what lies beyond them. Their entire purpose is to conceal information, not provide it. A blindfold disguised as data. The man studies the numbers. Then he begins to draw. A line. Another. Something elongated. A sense of water nearby. Open space. Metal. The impressions arrive without explanation, appearing and fading before they can fully settle into words. He writes them down quickly, trying to capture them before interpretation takes over. Outside the room, the world remains entirely ordinary. That may be the strangest detail in this entire story. Nothing here resembles the popular image of a mystery. There are no glowing machines, no hidden chambers, no dramatic displays of secret technology. Just government furniture, stale coffee, filing cabinets, and a handful of people attempting to answer a question that should have been easy to dismiss. Yet somehow it wasn't. For more than 20 years, intelligence agencies, military officers, scientists and analysts returned to that question again and again, not because they had solved it, because they hadn't. The project would eventually become known as Stargate. Today, the name tends to summon images of psychic spies and classified revelations. Depending on who is telling the story, it is remembered as either a remarkable breakthrough or an expensive mistake. The actual history is much harder to summarize, because Stargate was never built on certainty. It was built on doubt. The kind of doubt that survives every attempt to eliminate it. Before there were books, documentaries, and decades of debate, there was a small but persistent concern moving through parts of the intelligence community. What if someone occasionally acquired information they had no obvious way of obtaining? Not consistently, not reliably, not enough to replace satellites or reconnaissance aircraft, just often enough to create hesitation. And hesitation can be surprisingly powerful, especially during the Cold War. The Cold War rewarded caution. Entire careers were shaped by the fear of overlooking something important. Every rumor carried a possibility, however small, that dismissing it could become a costly mistake later. In that environment, strange ideas possessed an unusual resilience. Most people assume intelligence agencies spend their time deciding what to believe. In reality, they often spend just as much time deciding what cannot safely be ignored. The difference sounds small. History suggests otherwise. Entire programs have begun because someone worried that dismissing an unlikely possibility might prove more dangerous than investigating it. And surprise had become one of the most feared words in government. The result was a project unlike almost anything else funded during the era. Most Cold War programs revolved around machines, satellites, aircraft, sensors, computers. Stargate centered on something far less predictable: the human mind. The method eventually became known as remote viewing. The phrase sounds dramatic, but the process itself was surprisingly plain. A viewer received a target identifier and attempted to describe a location, object, or event without being told what the target actually was. The goal was not prediction, at least not officially. The goal was perception, or the possibility of perception. Most sessions looked exactly as a skeptic might expect. Fragments, vague impressions, sketches that seemed to drift somewhere between observation and imagination. A tower, a structure, a body of water, an industrial shape that might mean something, or nothing. Entire folders filled with uncertainty. And there were many folders, far more than most people realize. One of the most surprising things about the Stargate archive is how little of it resembles a mystery. The overwhelming majority consists of paperwork, session transcripts, evaluation sheets, administrative correspondence, funding discussions, internal reviews, arguments. Thousands of pages documenting intelligent people trying to determine whether they were studying a genuine phenomenon or a remarkably persistent illusion. That distinction never became easier. In fact, it became harder. Because ideas that fail completely tend to disappear. Ideas that succeed completely tend to transform the world around them. The difficult category is everything in between. That was where Stargate lived. Not in proof, not in failure. In the narrow territory separating the two. Every so often, a session would produce something that lingered. A sketch that seemed unexpectedly close to a real location. A description that aligned with information discovered later. A detail that survived comparison with reality, a little better than anyone expected. Never enough. But often enough. Enough for another discussion. Another review. Another request for funding. Another year. Again and again, the project endured because the uncertainty endured. The further one reads into the archive, the stranger the story becomes. Not because the evidence grows stronger, because the ambiguity becomes harder to escape. The documents reveal scientists arguing with analysts, analysts arguing with managers, managers arguing with statistics, everyone studying the same material, everyone arriving at different conclusions. Some believed the sessions hinted at an unexplored human ability. Others saw methodological flaws, selective memory, and coincidence elevated into significance. Many spent years occupying the uncomfortable space between those positions, too skeptical to accept, too curious to dismiss. That middle ground may be the true setting of this story. Not a laboratory, not an intelligence facility, a landscape of uncertainty. And like all unresolved landscapes, it has proven remarkably difficult to leave behind. Even now, decades after the program ended, the files retain the same quality as those early sketches. Incomplete, suggestive, quietly resistant to explanation. The pencil rests on the desk. The page is no longer blank. The lines are there. The target remains hidden. And before anyone could determine whether remote viewing worked, they first had to answer a far more revealing question. Why? Was the United States government willing to investigate something that sounded impossible in the first place? The answer begins far from this quiet room. It begins in a world shaped by rivalry, suspicion, and a growing fear that somewhere beyond the horizon, an adversary might already be searching for the same thing. Chapter 2. The Cold War's Odd Race. Fear rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. More often, it settles in quietly. A memo that cannot be verified. A report that refuses to disappear. A possibility nobody can comfortably dismiss. By the middle decades of the Cold War, the United States had become deeply familiar with that kind of fear. It had been surprised before. Entire governments remembered the feeling. The realization that something important had been happening beyond view. A weapon, a technology, a capability, a decision made years earlier and discovered only after the consequences arrived. Those moments left scars. Not visible ones, institutional ones. They lingered inside agencies, briefing rooms, and intelligence assessments long after the headlines faded. Surprise had become something to avoid at almost any cost. The challenge, of course, was that preventing surprise often required paying attention to ideas that sounded unreasonable, especially when those ideas appeared to interest an adversary. Somewhere inside government offices, translated reports began circulating. Most were unremarkable. A few were not. References to unusual research programs, studies involving telepathy, experiments exploring consciousness, claims that Soviet scientists were investigating phenomena many Western researchers considered dubious at best. The details changed depending on the source. The rumors changed depending on who was repeating them. But a single question kept resurfacing. What if they were taking it seriously? Not because it worked, because they believed it might. That distinction mattered. During the Cold War, perception could be almost as important as reality. A nation did not need proof that its rival possessed an advantage. Sometimes the possibility alone was enough to trigger a response. Imagine an analyst opening a folder late in the afternoon. Most of the material inside appears uncertain. Fragments of translated journals, second-hand reports, scattered references collected from multiple sources. Nothing definitive, nothing convincing, nothing entirely dismissible. That last category caused the most trouble. Clear evidence is easy to handle. So is obvious nonsense. The difficult cases occupy the territory in between. The folder remains on the desk. The questions remain unanswered. Months pass. The uncertainty remains. And uncertainty has a habit of attracting attention, especially when national security becomes involved. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to imagine intelligence officials laughing these ideas out of the room. The historical record suggests something more complicated. Many of the people involved were skeptics. Some were deeply skeptical. But skepticism does not eliminate responsibility. If there was nothing there, they wanted to know. If there was something there, they wanted to know that too. Either outcome was preferable to being caught unaware. That logic shaped countless Cold War decisions. Again and again, governments found themselves investigating possibilities they considered unlikely, simply because the consequences of being wrong felt worse than the cost of looking. Remote viewing entered the conversation through that opening, not as a revolutionary breakthrough, not as a widely accepted theory, as a question, a persistent one. The more it was examined, the more difficult it became to classify. Complete success would have changed intelligence history. Complete failure would have ended the discussion quickly. Instead, the subject occupied a strange middle ground. Just enough unusual results to survive. Just enough uncertainty to generate another review, another meeting, another allocation of funding, another year. The pattern repeated itself so often that it became part of the story. Supporters found reasons for optimism. Critics found reasons for caution. Neither side managed to close the argument. Meanwhile, the Cold War continued overhead. Satellites crossed the darkness above the planet. Submarines disappeared beneath oceans. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed distant landscapes. Every available method of collecting information was refined, expanded, and improved. Against that backdrop, the investigation of consciousness occupied an unusual place. Not central, not trusted, not ignored. Existing just far enough outside convention to remain uncomfortable. And discomfort, more than belief, kept the subject alive. The officials approving these studies were not necessarily asking whether psychic perception existed. Many were asking a simpler question. Was there a signal hidden somewhere inside all the noise? A weak signal? A difficult signal? A signal nobody yet understood? And if such a thing existed, who would recognize it first? That question eventually led away from intelligence briefings and into a research institute in California. There, a small group of scientists attempted something ambitious, not proving the phenomenon, not explaining it. Something arguably more difficult. They tried to build a system around it, a repeatable process, a structured method, a way of examining uncertainty without surrendering to it. One thing I've always found interesting about stories like this is how differently people react to them. Some hear a tale of government overreach. Others hear a genuine mystery. If you find yourself leaning one way or the other as we go, I'd be curious to know where. For a government accustomed to measuring everything, that approach felt far more comfortable than belief. What followed would become one of the strangest research programs of the Cold War. Because once uncertainty enters a laboratory, people inevitably try to turn it into a machine. Chapter 3. Building a machine out of intuition. The birthplace of remote viewing was disappointingly ordinary. At least it would have seemed that way to anyone expecting mystery. No hidden compound, no underground facility, no room filled with strange devices humming beneath dim lights. The doors opened onto laboratories, desks, technical equipment, whiteboards crowded with equations, the familiar clutter of scientific work. If someone had wandered through Stanford Research Institute in the early 1970s, they might have walked past the project without noticing it at all. Outside, California moved through another ordinary day. Traffic drifted along distant roads. Students crossed campuses. Coffee cooled on desks. Inside, a small group of researchers were occupied with a question most scientists would have preferred to avoid, not because it sounded dangerous, because it sounded impossible. Yet impossible questions have a way of becoming interesting when they refuse to disappear. The researchers involved were not trying to prove magic. That misunderstanding has followed the story for decades. Their objective was both simpler and more ambitious. If unusual information occasionally appeared under controlled conditions, could it be studied? Could it be measured? Could it be turned into something repeatable? Modern institutions are built around a powerful assumption. If a phenomenon is real, it should eventually leave a pattern. A pattern can be documented. A documented pattern can be tested. A tested pattern can become a system. Remote viewing presented an uncomfortable problem. If there was a phenomenon hiding beneath the reports and anecdotes, it seemed reluctant to behave like one. And governments trust systems far more than mysteries. So the researchers attempted something unusual. They tried to build a system around uncertainty itself. Much of that effort centered on two physicists, Harold Puthoff, Russell Targ. Neither looked particularly interested in becoming characters in a paranormal legend. Their work reflected a far more practical concern. How do you investigate a claim without helping it succeed? The challenge was immediately apparent. Human beings leak information constantly. A glance, a gesture, a shift in tone, a casual remark delivered without thinking. Even silence can contain clues. The more extraordinary the claim, the more carefully those possibilities had to be eliminated. So the procedures became increasingly restrictive. Targets were hidden. Communication was minimized. Information was compartmentalized. Layer after layer of ordinary explanation was stripped away. Eventually, a session could begin with almost nothing at all. A blank page, a quiet room, a sequence of numbers. The numbers would later become one of the most misunderstood parts of the Stargate story. People often imagine them as some kind of coded connection to a distant target. In reality, they served almost the opposite purpose. The numbers existed to prevent information from entering the session. They were a barrier, a blindfold. The less anyone knew, the more valuable the result would be. At least that was the hope. Then came the difficult part. Waiting. Listening. Recording impressions before they became conclusions. Sometimes the impressions arrived as textures rather than images. A sense of height. The feeling of open space. Metal. Water. Movement somewhere beyond view. Fragments that seemed meaningful before they could be understood. The fragments arrived without context, and context was exactly what the mind wanted. That tension became one of the defining struggles of the entire program, because human beings are natural storytellers. Give the brain 3 disconnected pieces of information, and it immediately begins building a 4th. The researchers watched this happen repeatedly. A vague impression became a structure. The structure became a tower. The tower became a missile site. Certainty arrived long before evidence did. Remote viewers eventually developed a term for the process: analytic overlay, a clinical phrase for something deeply familiar. The moment interpretation outruns observation. The moment a possibility hardens into a belief. Again and again, sessions collided with that problem. Not fraud, not deception, meaning. The irresistible human urge to transform fragments into a finished picture. Researchers found themselves studying 2 mysteries at once: the possibility of remote viewing and the machinery of the human mind itself. The sessions accumulated. Pages filled with sketches, notes, descriptions, occasional correspondences, frequent failures, and a vast territory in between. That middle ground became increasingly difficult to navigate. One viewer describes water beside an industrial structure. Later, the target turns out to be a shipyard. Interesting. Another session produces nothing useful at all. A third appears promising, until closer examination reveals major errors. The pattern repeated endlessly. Every apparent signal arrived carrying noise with it. Every intriguing result arrived surrounded by uncertainty. For intelligence agencies, that posed a serious problem. Interesting is not the same thing as useful. A military operation cannot be planned around an impression. An analyst cannot brief decision makers with a feeling. National security demands reliability, and reliability remained frustratingly elusive. Years passed. The archive expanded. More sessions, more viewers, more evaluations, more arguments. Yet the central question remained stubbornly intact. Not whether unusual information occasionally appeared, whether anyone could identify it with confidence. That challenge may have been larger than remote viewing itself. A camera can be calibrated. A telescope can be tested. A sensor can be measured against known standards. But what happens when the instrument is a human mind? How do you calibrate intuition? How do you separate perception from expectation? How do you measure something that may change the moment you attempt to observe it? Those questions lingered long after individual sessions ended. They drifted through laboratories, reports, and conference rooms, and eventually they escaped the laboratory altogether. Because a theory can remain protected inside controlled conditions for only so long. Sooner or later, someone asks the question every research program eventually faces. Does it work outside the experiment? For Stargate, that question led toward real intelligence targets, real operations, real consequences. And with them came the individual who would become the most debated figure in the program's history. If these quiet, late-night documentaries have become part of your routine, subscribing is a simple way to let me know you'd like more of them. Now, let's move on to our next chapter. A man whose sessions would force even experienced analysts into an uncomfortable position, not because they provided answers, because they made the uncertainty harder to ignore. Chapter 4. The language of hidden places. Every specialized profession eventually develops its own language. Pilots have one. Surgeons have one. Intelligence officers have one. Remote viewers built one too. That alone is worth noticing, because languages do not emerge from certainty. They emerge from repetition, from people encountering the same problem often enough that ordinary words stop being sufficient. By the time Stargate was fully underway, viewers had begun describing experiences that were difficult to fit inside conventional categories. Not because the information was clear, because it wasn't. Most sessions began in almost comical simplicity. A blank sheet of paper, a target number, a quiet room. Nothing else. No photograph, no description, no clue about what waited at the other end of the process. Only absence. The absence was intentional. Researchers wanted as little contamination as possible. The less anyone knew, the fewer opportunities existed for ordinary information to slip into the session. The result was a strange kind of blindness. The viewer knew almost nothing. The monitor knew almost nothing. The target remained hidden behind layers of procedure. And from that uncertainty, a peculiar vocabulary emerged. Viewers were encouraged to avoid naming things. Names were dangerous. Names arrived too quickly. The moment a person identified an object, imagination often rushed in behind it. So the training moved in the opposite direction. Instead of saying tower, describe height. Instead of saying submarine, describe enclosure. Instead of saying bridge, describe span. Cold, metallic, echoing, open, angular, elevated. The target became less like a location and more like a collection of qualities waiting to be assembled. To outsiders, the process often sounded absurd. To participants, it felt necessary. They were attempting to separate observation from interpretation, a surprisingly difficult task. Human beings rarely experience reality in fragments. The mind prefers finished pictures. It wants conclusions, stories, meaning. Remote viewing asked people to resist that impulse, to remain inside uncertainty longer than felt comfortable. That proved harder than almost anything else. Many sessions began with what viewers called an ideogram, a quick mark made at the very beginning of contact with a target. Sometimes it was little more than a slash across the page, a curve, a looping shape, a sudden movement of the hand. Viewed afterward, the marks often appeared meaningless. Viewed beforehand, some participants believed they represented something important, the earliest hint of information, a signal arriving before conscious interpretation had the opportunity to interfere. Whether that belief was justified remains impossible to determine. What matters is what it reveals. Again and again, the people involved became suspicious of their own thoughts. Not because they lacked confidence, because they possessed too much of it. Confidence appeared easily. Accuracy did not. That realization eventually produced one of the most famous terms in the entire Stargate archive: analytic overlay, AOL. The phrase sounds technical enough to belong inside a laboratory report. In practice, it describes something nearly everyone has experienced. The moment a guess disguises itself as certainty, a shape becomes a building. The building becomes a factory. The factory becomes a military installation. Within seconds, fragments have transformed into a complete narrative. The story arrives fully formed before the evidence has an opportunity to object. Viewers learn to watch for this process carefully. When they caught themselves inventing explanations, they marked the moment and moved on. Not because the explanation was automatically wrong, because nobody could trust where it originated. In a strange way, remote viewing became an exercise in arguing with one's own mind, not pursuing certainty, delaying it, holding back conclusions for as long as possible. The process could be frustrating. Hours of concentration often produced little of value. A session might generate pages of impressions that never connected to anything recognizable. Another might produce a sketch that looked meaningful, until closer examination dissolved the resemblance. The archive contains thousands of such moments. Most are forgettable. That is an important detail. The popular image of Stargate often focuses on dramatic cases. The actual files are dominated by routine uncertainty. Page after page of incomplete information. Page after page of possibilities. Page after page of people attempting to listen carefully enough to distinguish signal from invention. Yet every so often, something unusual appeared. A description that lingered. A sketch that seemed unexpectedly close. A detail that survived comparison with reality better than anyone expected. Those moments rarely settled the debate. Instead, they extended it. One more discussion. One more review. One more reason not to close the file. Over time, the process acquired a rhythm. A miss. A miss. A possible hit. A disagreement. Another miss. The pattern repeated so often that it became part of the program's foundation. Stargate survived because certainty never arrived. Neither did failure. The project remained suspended between the two. A place where questions could continue living indefinitely. And eventually, those questions became attached to a single individual. Not a scientist, not a statistician, a former police commissioner. His sessions would become some of the most discussed in the history of the program, not because they ended the argument, because they made it considerably more difficult to ignore. As strange as all this may sound, try not to decide too quickly. One of the interesting things about the Stargate story is how often people change their minds as they move through the files. For years, the mystery had existed inside methods, procedures, and reports. Now, it would acquire a face. And with that face came some of the most controversial claims Stargate would ever produce. Chapter 5. The project that could not keep its name. Questions are easier to manage when they fit inside a folder. Governments understand folders. They understand reporting chains, departments, budgets, oversight committees. Every problem is expected to belong somewhere. Stargate never did. That may explain why it spent so much of its existence changing names. Follow the paper trail far enough, and the project begins to resemble a person constantly moving between identities. Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, Stargate. One designation replaces another, then another, then another. To modern readers, the sequence can appear suspicious, almost theatrical, as though each new title concealed a deeper secret. The reality was less dramatic, and perhaps more revealing. Programs usually change names because organizations change around them. Managers come and go. Responsibilities shift. Reporting structures are reorganized. The paperwork adapts. The names adapt. Stargate adapted so often that it began to feel less like a permanent program and more like a traveler passing through borrowed offices. Each transfer reflected the same underlying uncertainty. Nobody seemed entirely sure what this thing was. A scientific study, an intelligence asset, a research project, an operational tool, a curiosity that had somehow survived longer than expected. The answer changed depending on who was asked. And that uncertainty slowly spread through the bureaucracy itself. Imagine arriving at Fort Meade before sunrise. The building is already awake. Lights glow behind office windows. Coffee brews somewhere down the hall. Stacks of reports wait on desks for analysts who have not yet arrived. Most of the work being conducted inside concerns familiar subjects. Weapons systems, foreign governments, military capabilities, satellite imagery, the business of national security. Yet somewhere inside the same network of offices, another group is attempting something considerably harder to categorize. They are trying to determine whether information can occasionally appear without a clear source. The contrast feels strange. It felt strange then too. Programs with obvious value tend to settle into stable positions. Everyone understands why they exist. Everyone understands where they belong. Stargate never achieved that comfort. Instead, it drifted. One office inherited responsibility, then another. One manager approved it, another questioned it, a third attempted to redefine it entirely. The project remained. The explanations changed. The code names revealed traces of that history, not because the names themselves matter, because they mark the program's movement through the system. Each one represents another attempt to classify something that resisted classification, and governments have always struggled with categories that refuse to cooperate. A missile program is easy. An aircraft program is easy. Even a failed program is relatively easy. Failures can be cancelled. Successes can be expanded. The difficult cases are the unresolved ones. The projects that never become convincing enough to celebrate and never become weak enough to eliminate. Those projects linger, year after year, budget after budget, review after review. Stargate occupied exactly that territory. The archive preserves the result. Reading through the documents often feels less like following a single investigation and more like wandering through overlapping timelines. A report references an earlier project name. A later memorandum references a different one. Evaluations draw upon studies conducted under designations that no longer officially exist. The labels shift constantly. The central question does not. Can hidden information be accessed? Can it be accessed reliably? Can it become useful? Every version of the program inherited those same questions. None managed to answer them. Over time, a curious pattern emerges. The government was not merely studying remote viewing. It was attempting to decide what remote viewing actually was. A scientific phenomenon. A collection method. A psychological anomaly. An intelligence capability. A statistical curiosity. Every possibility appears somewhere in the archive. No single interpretation ever wins. That may be why the project survived. The ambiguity surrounding the phenomenon became mirrored by ambiguity surrounding the program itself. Nobody could fully define either one. The result was decades of administrative motion. New offices, new oversight, new justifications, new code names. Yet beneath every change, the same uncertainty remained waiting. Supporters examined the files and saw potential. Critics examined the same files and saw flaws. Managers saw costs. Analysts saw unanswered questions. Everyone inherited the same mountain of paperwork. Everyone discovered a different story inside it. That is what makes the archive so unusual. Not the claims, not the sketches, the persistence, the sheer number of intelligent people who encountered the uncertainty and failed to reach the same conclusion. Year after year, the bureaucracy attempted to organize the mystery. Year after year, the mystery remained stubbornly disorganized. Eventually, however, the debate would stop revolving around procedures, budgets, and reporting structures. It would become attached to a person, a former police commissioner named Pat Price. For years, Stargate had survived as an argument. price transformed it into a case study. And for some analysts, that distinction would prove far more difficult to ignore, because a method can remain abstract. A result cannot. Especially when the result appears just specific enough to make coincidence feel uncomfortable. Chapter 6. The problem of real stakes. For years, remote viewing had existed in a protected environment. A failed session meant little. Another experiment, another report, another discussion around a conference table. The consequences rarely extended beyond paperwork. Then, the outside world arrived, and the outside world demanded answers. In November of 1979, Iranian revolutionaries seized the United States Embassy in Tehran and took dozens of Americans hostage. Almost immediately, uncertainty became a national problem. Intelligence agencies needed information. Not eventually. Now. Where were the hostages? Who controlled them? Were they being moved? Could they be rescued? Questions that had once existed inside research programs suddenly carried weight. Real weight. The kind attached to lives. Until this point, Stargate had been allowed to exist as an experiment, an unusual one, a controversial one, but still an experiment. The hostage crisis changed the nature of the conversation. An experiment can afford ambiguity. An operation cannot. That distinction would follow the program for the rest of its existence. Somewhere inside secure facilities, remote viewers were tasked with targets connected to the crisis. The process itself changed very little. The same numbers, the same procedures, the same blank pages, the same uncertain method. Only the stakes were different. A viewer records impressions. Walls, open spaces, roads, confinement, movement, structures. The pages fill. The session ends. And then the difficult part begins. What now? Imagine sitting at a desk as an analyst during an international crisis. The report in front of you describes a guarded compound, vehicles, a courtyard, restricted movement, perhaps signs of captivity, perhaps not. The information sounds meaningful. The problem is that meaningful and useful are not the same thing. A description can feel specific while remaining impossible to act upon. A sketch can resemble reality while offering no practical advantage. Intelligence work demands something more difficult than intrigue. It demands decisions. Every report eventually forces someone to choose. Act, wait, redirect resources, ignore the lead, pursue the lead, accept the risk, reject the risk. The challenge facing Stargate was never producing material. It was producing material that survived those decisions. And that proved far more difficult. The hostage sessions exposed a problem that had always been present, but had remained partially hidden inside laboratory conditions. Interesting information is abundant. Actionable information is rare. A researcher can spend months studying possibilities. A military commander may have only hours. The difference changes everything. Suddenly, uncertainty becomes expensive. Every vague description carries consequences. Every incorrect interpretation consumes time. Every false lead competes with genuine intelligence. The margin for error shrinks dramatically. For the first time, remote viewing found itself facing the same standards imposed upon every other intelligence source. Not whether it occasionally produced unusual results, whether it could be trusted when trust mattered most. The answer remained frustratingly elusive. Some sessions appeared promising. Others dissolved under scrutiny. Certain descriptions seemed to align with existing intelligence. Others drifted toward generalities broad enough to fit multiple outcomes. Viewed one way, there were reasons for optimism. Viewed another, reasons for caution. Neither perspective disappeared. Meanwhile, the crisis continued. And that may be the most important detail. The world did not pause while analysts debated methodology. Events moved forward. Decisions had to be made. Time continued passing. Reality demanded conclusions even when certainty remained unavailable. That tension exposed something fundamental about Stargate. The program had spent years asking whether information could appear in unusual ways. Now it faced a more difficult question. Could unusual information compete with conventional intelligence? Satellites produced photographs. Intercepts produced communications. Sources produced reports. Each method possessed weaknesses. Each method also possessed standards. Remote viewing was being asked to enter that world, not as a curiosity, as a tool. The distinction mattered enormously. Tools are judged differently than experiments. A phenomenon can be fascinating and still fail operationally. It can produce intriguing results and remain unusable. The hostage crisis forced everyone involved to confront that possibility. For some participants, it was an uncomfortable realization. For others, it was confirmation of long-standing doubts. For the program itself, it became a turning point. Because once real-world operations enter the picture, the conversation changes permanently. Questions become sharper. Expectations become higher. Tolerance for ambiguity begins to shrink. Yet something curious happened. The program survived. Not because it solved the crisis. It didn't. Not because it delivered undeniable success. It didn't. The reason was stranger. The sessions generated just enough uncertainty to prevent closure. Just enough unusual details. Just enough unresolved questions. Just enough possibility. The pattern that had sustained Stargate from the beginning remained intact. Every apparent answer seemed to generate another question. Every attempt at resolution revealed another layer of doubt. The door never quite closed, and among the growing collection of cases, one figure continued attracting attention. A former police commissioner, whose sessions appeared more specific than many others. More detailed. More difficult to forget. If you've been listening quietly up to this point, you might already have an opinion about what was happening inside these programs. The people involved spent years trying to reach one. They never quite managed it. If the hostage work revealed the limits of remote viewing, Pat Price would reveal why those limits remained so fiercely debated. Because sometimes the most persistent mysteries are not the ones that convince everyone. They are the ones that convince just enough people to keep looking. Chapter 7. The People Who Would Not Believe. Every mystery eventually encounters a different kind of obstacle. Not a lack of evidence, a disagreement about what evidence actually is. By the time Stargate reached maturity, the program had accumulated years of experiments, operational cases, evaluations, and arguments. The archive was growing. The files were growing. The debate was growing with them. What remained stubbornly absent was consensus. Popular retellings often reduced the story to a simple conflict. Believers on one side, skeptics on the other. The reality was considerably more complicated. Many of the program's strongest critics were not outsiders looking in. They were already inside the room, reading the reports, reviewing the sessions, examining the same material as everyone else. Their objections rarely began with ridicule. More often, they began with questions. Questions that proved remarkably difficult to answer. Imagine a conference room late in the day. The conversations have slowed. Coffee has gone cold. Stacks of transcripts sit beside statistical summaries and evaluation reports. The atmosphere feels less like an investigation and more like a trial. Not a trial of remote viewing, a trial of the evidence itself. One analyst points toward a successful session. Another asks how success should be measured. A researcher cites unusual correspondences. Someone else questions the scoring method. The discussion advances, then circles back, then advances again. The same files, the same data, different conclusions, again and again. At first glance, the disagreements appear technical. In reality, they touched something much deeper. Every intelligence organization depends upon standards. Standards determine what deserves attention, what deserves funding, what deserves action. Without standards, information becomes impossible to evaluate. The challenge facing Stargate was that nobody fully agreed on which standards should apply. A viewer describes a distant structure. Later, investigators discover that a similar structure exists. What does that mean? The answer sounds obvious until someone asks a second question. How similar? Then a third. How often? Then a fourth. Would the result appear again under identical conditions? The certainty begins dissolving almost immediately. The archive is filled with moments like this. A result that appears persuasive. A criticism that appears reasonable. An answer followed closely by another question. The pattern repeats so frequently that it becomes one of the defining characteristics of the program. Nothing remains settled for very long. One of the most revealing aspects of the debate is how often participants agreed on the observations while disagreeing on the conclusions. Everyone could see the same sketch. Everyone could read the same transcript. The conflict emerged afterward, when interpretation entered the room. Was the result meaningful? Was it coincidence? Was it evidence of a phenomenon? Or evidence of the extraordinary flexibility of human perception? The same document could support multiple explanations simultaneously. That is a difficult environment in which to reach consensus, especially for people whose professional lives depend upon making judgments under uncertainty. Over time, the discussion evolved into something larger than remote viewing. It became a debate about thresholds. How much evidence should be required before a claim is taken seriously? How much uncertainty remains acceptable? How many failures outweigh a success? How many successes justify continued investigation? There are no universal answers to those questions. Different fields solve them differently. Different institutions solve them differently. The people inside Stargate were attempting to solve them in real time, and the consequences extended far beyond philosophy. Budgets depended on the answers. Careers depended on the answers. The future of the program depended on the answers. Yet the archive repeatedly resisted resolution. Some participants became convinced that a genuine signal existed somewhere within the data. Weak, difficult to isolate, but present. Others arrived at a different conclusion. Not fraud, not deception, something arguably more common. Human beings finding patterns because human beings are built to find patterns. Neither interpretation disappeared. Neither interpretation achieved total victory. The argument endured because both explanations seemed capable of surviving contact with the evidence. That may be the most remarkable feature of the entire story. The same collection of documents produced radically different levels of confidence in intelligent people examining the same material. The debate persisted for years, then decades, and eventually the question grew too large to remain internal. Sooner or later, every long-running program reaches a moment of reckoning. Someone outside the system is asked to review the evidence and make a judgment. For Stargate, that moment was approaching. The archive had become too large. The history too long. The disagreement too persistent. What began as scattered experiments would soon face its most comprehensive evaluation. Not another session. Not another argument. An attempt to weigh the entire record at once. Thousands of pages. Millions of dollars. Decades of uncertainty. One final effort to determine whether the phenomenon had survived scrutiny, or whether scrutiny itself had become the story. The answer would satisfy almost no one, which, in hindsight, may have been the most predictable outcome of all. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Archive. Long after the experiments ended, the paper remained. The viewers left. The funding disappeared. The offices changed hands. Entire careers reached retirement. Still, the paper remained. Boxes, shelves, cabinets, storage rooms filled with records, documenting one of the strangest investigations of the Cold War. The archive is larger than most people expect. That realization arrives quickly. Not because the material is dramatic, because there is so much of it. Thousands upon thousands of pages. Session transcripts. Handwritten sketches. Evaluation reports. Budget requests. Statistical reviews. Internal disagreements. Years of uncertainty converted into paperwork. From a distance, The collection sounds like a repository of secrets. Up close, it often resembles administration. That contrast is part of what makes it so unusual. Open one file, and a remote viewer is attempting to describe a distant location. Open another, and someone is discussing scheduling. A third contains an argument about methodology. A fourth concerns funding. The extraordinary and the mundane sit side by side, sharing the same folders. Page after page. Box after box. The deeper one moves into the archive. The stranger it begins to feel, not because of what any individual document contains, because of what the collection reveals when viewed as a whole. Most mysteries revolve around a discovery. Stargate revolves around persistence. The question is not why the program existed. The question is why it continued existing, why the files kept growing, why the reports kept accumulating, why so many intelligent people kept returning to the same unresolved problem. Governments are remarkably efficient at forgetting failures. Entire programs vanish from memory. Reports disappear into storage. Budgets end. Attention moves elsewhere. Yet the Stargate archive expanded year after year, not as a monument to success, not as evidence of a breakthrough, as a record of a question nobody could settle. That distinction becomes increasingly important the longer one spends with the material. Many readers arrive hoping to find a revelation, a decisive document, a hidden answer, something capable of ending the debate once and for all. The archive has a habit of disappointing those expectations. Instead of certainty, it offers accumulation. One session, then another. One argument, then another. One intriguing result followed immediately by a frustrating failure. The pattern repeats endlessly. A description aligns unexpectedly well with a target. A sketch survives comparison better than anyone anticipated. Then the next file dissolves into ambiguity, the next into contradiction, the next into nothing at all. The archive behaves almost like a conversation, not a conclusion. A conversation extending across decades. Thousands of voices participating. Researchers, analysts, managers, viewers, reviewers, each adding another page to a discussion nobody quite manages to finish. Imagine spending an afternoon inside those files. Hours pass. Most of what you read feels ordinary. Fragments, misses, unconvincing results. The kind of material a skeptic would expect. Then something catches your attention. A detail, a correspondence, a sketch. Not enough to persuade, enough to interrupt dismissal, enough to create hesitation. And hesitation appears repeatedly throughout the archive. That may be its defining characteristic. Not conviction, not disbelief. A lingering reluctance to settle the question. Again and again, the documents place readers in a position where certainty feels slightly premature. The effect accumulates. One file rarely changes a person's mind. Hundreds of files can make confidence feel more complicated. This is why the archive often feels less like evidence and more like terrain, a landscape crossed by different travelers. Some leave convinced they have found signs of something genuine. Others leave convinced they have witnessed a remarkable exercise in human pattern recognition. Both can point to documents supporting their position. Both can cite examples. Neither can entirely eliminate the other. The archive refuses to cooperate, and perhaps that is why it survived. The collection was never cleaned into a persuasive narrative. The failures remain. The contradictions remain. The awkward moments remain. The pages where absolutely nothing happened remain. Had someone wanted to build a case, much of that material could have disappeared. Instead, the confusion survived alongside everything else. What remains today is not merely evidence. It is process. A record of people thinking, arguing, testing, questioning, changing their minds, then changing them again. Few historical archives preserve uncertainty so completely. Most preserve conclusions. Stargate preserved the struggle to reach one. That may be why the files continue attracting new readers decades after the program ended. People are not simply encountering documents. They are inheriting an unfinished argument. Every folder contains another attempt to separate signal from coincidence. Every report contains another effort to determine whether perception has limits we do not fully understand. Every evaluation asks a slightly different version of the same question. What exactly happened here? The archive never answers. It only continues. Shelf after shelf, box after box, year after year. A paper monument to unresolved curiosity. Eventually, however, even curiosity encounters bureaucracy. The collection had become too large. The debate had lasted too long. The government wanted something the archive itself could never provide. A verdict. Not another transcript. Not another experiment. An answer. The task of delivering that answer would soon fall to outside reviewers. These archives have a habit of pulling people in different directions. Some readers become more skeptical the deeper they go. Others become more curious. I'd be interested to know which direction this story is pulling you. If you're still awake, that is. And what they discovered would prove almost as divisive as the archive itself. Because after decades of investigation, the final judgment arrived carrying a familiar problem. It refused to settle the question. Chapter 9. The verdict that wasn't. Every long argument eventually reaches a moment of judgment. At least that is the expectation. Years of debate. Years of evidence. Years of disagreement. Eventually, someone is supposed to decide. By the mid-1990s, Stargate had reached that point. The experiments had been conducted. The operational cases had accumulated. The reports filled boxes. The discussions stretched across decades. What remained was a question that could no longer be postponed. Had any of it actually worked? Not occasionally, not theoretically, not statistically. Worked. For more than 2 decades, the question had survived every review, every reorganization, every attempt to resolve it. Now the government wanted something it had never been able to obtain. A conclusion. After more than 20 years of uncertainty, that request seemed reasonable. The challenge was that uncertainty had become the archive's defining feature, and uncertainty does not become easier to evaluate simply because a deadline arrives. In 1995, outside reviewers were asked to examine the program. Their task appeared straightforward. Review the evidence, assess the results, determine whether Stargate had demonstrated sufficient value to justify its continued existence. Simple on paper, far more complicated in practice. Because by this point, the archive resembled less a collection of findings and more a record of disagreement. Every box contained arguments. Every study generated questions. Every apparent success arrived carrying qualifications. The reviewers inherited decades of unresolved conversations, operational reports, laboratory experiments, statistical analyses, misses, near misses, contradictions, unexpected correspondences, the accumulated history of people trying to understand something that never behaved consistently enough to satisfy anyone. Imagine sitting down with the collection for the first time. One report suggests unusually successful results. Another challenges the methodology. A third points towards statistical significance. A fourth questions the assumptions beneath the statistics. The deeper you go, the more difficult certainty becomes. Not because evidence is absent, because evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. The archive contains reasons for belief. The archive contains reasons for doubt. Both survive scrutiny more effectively than many people expect. That was the problem. A complete failure would have simplified the review. A complete success would have simplified it as well. Stargate offered neither. Instead, it occupied the narrow territory where judgment becomes uncomfortable. The final assessment reflected that discomfort. The reviewers did not conclude that nothing unusual had occurred, nor did they conclude that remote viewing had become a reliable intelligence capability. They arrived somewhere between those positions, a place the program itself had occupied for decades. Some of the data appeared intriguing. Certain experimental results exceeded what chance alone seemed likely to produce. Some sessions generated correspondences that researchers considered difficult to dismiss entirely. Yet another question immediately followed. Could those results be trusted operationally? That question proved decisive. Laboratories and intelligence agencies solve different problems. A laboratory can study anomalies. An intelligence organization must make decisions. One seeks understanding. The other seeks reliability. And reliability remained elusive. Again and again, reviewers encountered the same obstacle. Even when a result appeared impressive, nobody possessed a dependable method for determining its accuracy in advance. A session might seem extraordinary or meaningless. The difficulty was knowing which before the answer became available. That distinction mattered enormously. An intelligent source that cannot reliably identify its own successes creates a dangerous situation. Sometimes it will be correct. Sometimes it will not. The challenge is that nobody knows which outcome has occurred until afterward. Viewed from that perspective, the problem becomes obvious. The question was never simply whether remote viewing produced information. The question was whether decision makers could trust the information when it mattered. lives, operations, resources, national decisions. The final review concluded that the answer was no. Not because every result failed, because the uncertainty surrounding the results remained too great. For supporters of the program, the conclusion felt incomplete. For critics, it felt justified. And even among the reviewers themselves, consensus remained elusive. Jessica Utz examined much of the evidence and saw indications of a genuine phenomenon worthy of continued attention. Ray Hyman examined much of the same evidence and reached a different conclusion. The disagreement was striking, not because one person was correct and the other was wrong, because the dispute echoed the entire history of Stargate. Two intelligent observers, one archive, two interpretations. The final review ended exactly where the program had spent decades living, inside disagreement. That may be the most remarkable aspect of the evaluation. It was supposed to resolve the argument. Instead, it became part of it. The closure arrived quietly. No dramatic announcement. No final experiment. No ceremonial ending. Only reports. Recommendations. Budget decisions. Personnel transfers. The familiar administrative machinery through which governments conclude unfinished business. The offices emptied. The project ended. The funding disappeared. Officially, the story was over. Yet something survived. The review answered a bureaucratic question. It did not answer a human one. People still wanted to know what had happened. What exactly had produced those occasional correspondences? What had generated the persistent uncertainty? What had convinced some participants while leaving others unconvinced? The evaluation offered no final explanation. Only limits. Limits on confidence. Limits on usefulness. Limits on what could be claimed responsibly. The mystery itself remained untouched. Perhaps that is why the final report feels so unusual. Most verdicts reduce possibilities. This one preserved them. The evidence appeared too suggestive to dismiss entirely, too unreliable to trust completely. And somewhere between those two conclusions, Stargate reached its official end. Not with certainty, not with revelation, with a paradox. The same paradox that had sustained the program from the beginning. Enough evidence to continue asking questions. Not enough evidence to stop asking them. Once the files were released, that paradox escaped the intelligence community altogether. The project ceased to be a government program. It became something much harder to control. A story, a legend, an argument inherited by the public. And in many ways, that is where Stargate truly began its second life. Chapter 10. The people who stayed with the question. Most government programs end on paper. A report is written. A recommendation is approved. Funding disappears. Personnel move elsewhere. The institution turns its attention to something new. The paperwork reaches a conclusion, even when the people involved do not. Stargate was no exception. The program ended. The offices emptied. The code names disappeared. Yet for many of the individuals who spent years inside the project, something remained unfinished. Not the work, the question. That may be one of the strangest consequences of long investigations. When a mystery occupies enough years of a person's life, it becomes difficult to leave behind, even after the files are closed, even after the debates move elsewhere, even after retirement. Questions have a way of lingering, especially unanswered ones. Imagine meeting a former participant decades later. The Cold War is over. The program exists only in archives. The urgency is gone. The budget meetings are gone. The classified briefings are gone. All that remains is memory. And memory behaves differently than documentation. Reports preserve facts. Memory preserves impressions. The emotional texture of an experience. The feeling of spending years pursuing something that never fully revealed itself. Many participants remembered surprisingly ordinary details. The faint hum of fluorescent lights. The slow accumulation of paperwork. Hours spent waiting for something interesting to happen. And often, nothing did. The reality rarely resembled the mythology that would eventually grow around the program. There were no dramatic revelations waiting at the end of a corridor. No cinematic moments of certainty. Mostly, there was work. Hours of concentration. Hours of evaluation. Hours spent trying to determine whether a fragment of information deserved attention. Joseph McMoneagle, one of the most widely known viewers, often spoke about the process in practical terms. Not as magic, not as mystery, as a job. A difficult one, a profession built around information that could not be immediately verified. That uncertainty shaped people in different ways. Some developed routines. Some developed rituals. Some became more convinced over time. Others became less convinced. Many simply became more cautious. Because years spent confronting ambiguity can change how a person thinks. The archive records the sessions. The participants carried the experience itself. That distinction matters. Pat Price became a legend within parts of the remote viewing community. So did Ingo Swann. So did others whose names appear repeatedly throughout the files. Yet legends have a tendency to simplify people. The historical record tells a more complicated story. Behind every famous session stood an individual confronting the same uncertainty as everyone else. A promising result was never entirely free from doubt. A disappointing result was never entirely free from possibility. The ambiguity survived every participant. In some ways, it outlived them. That may explain why recollections often feel fragmented. One person remembers a striking correspondence. Another remembers endless evaluation procedures. A third remembers skepticism. A fourth remembers curiosity. The memories rarely align perfectly. Together, they create something more revealing than agreement ever could. a portrait of intelligent people navigating uncertainty for years at a time. And perhaps that is the most human aspect of the entire story. The official goal involved hidden information. The unofficial lesson involved human judgment. How much evidence is enough? How much doubt should remain? When does caution become closed-mindedness? When does openness become wishful thinking? Those questions followed participants long after the project ended. Some eventually concluded that a genuine phenomenon had been present all along. Others concluded that the search itself had generated many of the apparent results. Most occupied a far less comfortable position. Not convinced, not dismissive, simply unwilling to claim certainty where certainty had never arrived. That middle ground appears again and again in its reviews and recollections. A reluctance to overstate, a reluctance to close the file completely, an awareness that years of experience had produced fewer answers than expected. The paradox is difficult to miss. The longer people studied the subject, the more careful many became about describing it. Confidence often belongs to those who encounter a mystery briefly. Caution belongs to those who spend decades inside it. And few people spent longer inside this one than the participants themselves. Perhaps that is why Stargate continues attracting attention. Not because the documents contain a final revelation, because the people closest to the mystery never reached one. The archive preserves their reports. Their memories preserve something else. The experience of standing beside a question for years and never watching it disappear. A solved mystery eventually becomes history. An unresolved one becomes part of the people who carry it. And long after the offices closed, many participants still seem to be carrying the same thing. Not certainty, not belief, not disbelief. A question. One they had spent years examining from every possible angle, only to discover that some questions become more complicated the longer they are studied. That realization may be the most enduring legacy of Stargate. Not the sessions, not the sketches, not the statistics. The realization that intelligent people can devote decades to a problem and still emerge uncertain. For some, that conclusion feels unsatisfying. For others, it feels honest. Either way, it survives. And once the program entered public view, that uncertainty no longer belonged only to the people who lived through it. It belonged to everyone willing to open the files. The mystery was no longer confined to government offices. It had entered culture itself. And there, it would begin a very different life. Chapter 11. When the secret escaped. Most government programs end quietly. Budgets expire. Offices close. Files are stored. Attention moves elsewhere. The story fades with the paperwork. Stargate followed a different path. In some ways, the program became more alive after it ended. The official investigation concluded in 1995. The funding stopped. The personnel dispersed. The final evaluations were written. From an administrative perspective, the matter was finished. Yet that was precisely when the story escaped. Not from a laboratory, not from an intelligence facility, from the archive itself. For decades, Stargate had existed inside a relatively small world. researchers, analysts, military officers, reviewers, people arguing over the same collection of documents, people familiar with the limitations, the caveats, the uncertainties. Then the files entered public view, and public curiosity follows different rules. Imagine a newspaper stand on a wet morning, headlines competing for attention, politics, markets, wars, scandals. Then somewhere among them appears a story that sounds almost impossible. The government studied psychic spies. For a brief moment, one of the Cold War's strangest investigations stepped into ordinary life. The reaction was immediate. Some laughed. Some became fascinated. Others became suspicious. The story moved through television studios, newspapers, magazines, and radio programs with remarkable speed. The phrase itself seemed designed to survive. Psychic spies. 2 words capable of carrying an enormous amount of baggage. To many people, the conclusion felt obvious. The program was ridiculous, an embarrassing misuse of resources. Proof that governments occasionally wander into absurd territory. The jokes practically wrote themselves. Comedians embraced it. Columnists mocked it. Late-night television found weeks of material. For a time, laughter became the dominant public response. Yet something unexpected happened. The story refused to disappear. Most jokes have short lives. Stargate did not. Yet beneath the jokes sat an uncomfortable fact. Whatever had happened, it had happened inside real institutions, with real funding, real personnel, and years of sustained investigation behind it. That reality complicated the punchline. The deeper people looked, the harder the story became to classify. Not because the evidence suddenly became convincing, because the uncertainty proved authentic. The confusion was genuine. The disagreement was genuine. The lack of resolution was genuine. And genuine uncertainty has a peculiar durability. Soon, journalists began reading through the archive. Authors began writing books. Researchers started examining evaluations and case studies. Everyone arrived carrying a different question. Almost everyone left carrying a different answer. The files behaved strangely in public. Less like evidence, more like a mirror. A skeptic opened the archive and discovered methodological flaws. A believer opened the same archive and discovered intriguing correspondences. A psychologist found examples of pattern recognition. A historian found Cold War anxiety. A conspiracy theorist found hidden agendas. The documents supported all of these readings while refusing to belong entirely to any of them. That may be one of the reasons Stargate survived its own declassification. Most mysteries become smaller when exposed. This one became larger, because once the files entered culture, they stopped belonging exclusively to the intelligence community. The story began evolving. Pat Price became larger than life. Joe McMoneagle became a central figure in countless retellings. Individual sessions acquired reputations of their own. Stories spread. Details shifted. Interpretations multiplied. The archive entered a process familiar to every enduring mystery. It became folklore. That transformation is easy to overlook, yet it may be one of the most important developments in the entire story. Government documents carry a certain authority. People often assume that if a claim appears in an official file, the file itself validates the claim. Reality is rarely that simple. The archive contained questions. Culture often prefers answers, and so possibilities gradually hardened into narratives. A session became evidence. A correspondence became a revelation. A mystery became a belief. Not always. Not for everyone, but often enough. The program ceased to function as an intelligence record. It became a story people told. A modern legend assembled from transcripts, reports, and decades of unresolved debate. In a curious way, the public inherited the same problem that had frustrated the government. The files offered too much uncertainty for certainty, too much evidence for dismissal. The same tension survived the transition. Only the setting changed. The arguments moved from classified facilities to bookstores, from review panels to documentaries, from intelligence briefings to internet forums. The participants changed. The debate endured. What counted as evidence? What counted as coincidence? How much uncertainty was acceptable? How much confidence was justified? The questions remained remarkably familiar. And perhaps that is the strangest outcome of all. The intelligence community spent decades trying to determine whether hidden information could sometimes be reached in unusual ways. The public spent the following decades trying to determine what that investigation itself meant. Neither effort produced consensus. Both produced stories. That may be why Stargate continues attracting attention long after its official end. Not because it delivered answers, because it escaped them. The archive remains where it has always been, waiting. Thousands of pages filled with experiments, arguments, hopes, doubts, and unfinished conclusions. Yet the files are no longer the center of the story. The people reading them are, because every generation opens the archive searching for something slightly different, and every generation ends up confronting the same problem. The mystery refuses to become simple, which brings us to the final chapter. Not the question of whether remote viewing worked, not the question of whether psychic spies existed. A larger question. Why intelligent people pursued this possibility for so long, and what that pursuit reveals about the way human beings respond to uncertainty itself. Chapter 12. The question that remained. Most investigations end in one of two ways. A discovery is made, or the search is abandoned. Stargate managed something stranger. The search ended. The question survived. That distinction may explain why the story continues attracting attention decades after the offices closed and the funding disappeared. The program is gone. The people are aging. Many are gone as well. The Cold War itself has become history. Yet the question remains unexpectedly difficult to leave behind, not because the evidence grows stronger with time, because unresolved questions possess a peculiar durability. Answers tend to settle. Mysteries travel. Imagine standing outside a government building late at night. The parking lot sits empty beneath distant lights. The offices are dark. The conversations have ended. Inside filing cabinets and archive boxes rests the accumulated work of decades. Reports, sketches, arguments, evaluations. Thousands of pages produced by people attempting to understand something that never behaved quite the way they expected. The work is finished. The uncertainty remains. Perhaps that should not be surprising. Human beings have always been drawn toward hidden things. Long before intelligence agencies existed, people searched for knowledge beyond ordinary reach. Messages in dreams, patterns in the sky, meanings hidden inside coincidence. The methods changed across centuries. The impulse did not. Every generation inherits its own version of the same desire, to know what lies beyond the edge of certainty. In some ways, Stargate was simply one expression of that impulse, an ancient question wrapped in modern institutions. The setting happened to be laboratories, military facilities, and government offices. The underlying curiosity was much older. What makes the story unusual is not that people asked the question. It is how seriously they pursued it. Scientists examined it. Analysts evaluated it. Military officers reviewed it. Statisticians argued over it. Administrators funded it. Critics challenged it. Supporters defended it. For more than 2 decades, intelligent people invested extraordinary effort into a possibility many would dismiss within seconds. And after all that effort, the result remained stubbornly incomplete. That outcome feels unsatisfying. It is also remarkably human. Throughout this story, the same pattern has appeared repeatedly. A promising result, a reasonable objection, an intriguing correspondence, a methodological concern, progress, doubt, possibility, restraint. The archive never settles permanently on either side. Perhaps that is because the program was investigating more than remote viewing. It was investigating how people respond to uncertainty. How much evidence feels convincing? How much doubt remains acceptable? At what point does curiosity become conviction? At what point does conviction become a barrier to further inquiry? Those questions extend far beyond Stargate. They appear in science, history, medicine, politics, daily life. Every field that requires people to make decisions without possessing complete information. The participants carried those questions with them. The public inherited them later. And now the archive passes them to each new generation of readers. That may be the true legacy of the program. Not psychic spies, not secret powers, not hidden government knowledge. A case study in what happens when intelligent people encounter a mystery that refuses to cooperate. Some readers open the files and see evidence of an overlooked phenomenon. Others see evidence of human pattern recognition. Still others see a fascinating portrait of Cold War anxiety. Each interpretation finds support somewhere in the record. None fully eliminate the others. The archive remains what it has always been, a landscape of unresolved possibilities. And perhaps that is why it continues to endure. Not because it offers answers, because it offers participation. Every reader becomes part of the argument. Every reader must decide how much weight to assign the evidence, how much significance to assign the coincidences, how much confidence to place in uncertainty. The files never make the decision for them, they simply wait, patiently, year after year, for another person to open the box, to turn another page, to look at another sketch, and to ask the same question once more. What exactly happened here? The archive does not answer. The participants did not answer. The final review did not answer. Time itself has not answered. What remains is curiosity, the same force that created the project, the same force that sustained it, the same force that carried it beyond the Cold War and into the present. Curiosity is often mistaken for a search for answers. Sometimes it is. Other times it is simply the willingness to remain in the presence of a question. That may be the quiet lesson, hidden beneath all the reports, sketches, and arguments. Not every mystery exists to be solved immediately. Some exist to remind us how much remains uncertain. The offices are dark now. The budgets are gone. The code names belong to history. The sketches rest quietly in their folders. Yet somewhere between evidence and imagination, skepticism and wonder, certainty and possibility, the question remains, not demanding belief, not demanding agreement, only inviting another look. And perhaps that is enough. For tonight, the files can remain closed. And if you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you for spending part of your evening here. There is a playlist on screen now. If you would like to keep drifting through stories like this a little longer, you do not have to choose much. You can simply let the next story play whenever you are ready. The archive can rest. The mystery will still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently, exactly where it has always been.